Hi, my name is Santana Tucker, and I'm back with Bossy Part 2. Last time we tried to antedate Bossy, which proved unsuccessful as Oxford really did have the first known example of the word bossy as an adjective. But this time we'll be looking at bossy as a sexist term with the help of Google Ngram and show how the term has kind of evolved and maybe take a shot at explaining why the word became relevant in the first place. Just a recap of what we talked about last time. Bossy came up 3 times in the OED, and the first one was an adjective meaning swelling in or like a boss, projecting in rounded form, having bosses or prominence. The second was a noun meaning a calf or a cow, and the third one was what we were looking for, meaning given to acting as a boss or leader, which took me to a noun, bossy boots, meaning a domineering person. We took a look at Google Ngrams, and it showed that when you put in bossy woman, bossy man, bossy person, there's a pretty noticeable difference in how frequently bossy woman is used, and we saw that date was around the 1950s when that separation became pretty clear. And we ultimately came to the conclusion that Harper's Magazine really was to thank for this. It has been recognized 1,319 times as a source providing the first evidence of a word, and that remains true for bossy. Just to be clear that I'm not making this issue up of women's likability being a problem, I found this case study in my research that was done at Harvard in the year 2000, and it looked at one of its graduates who became a successful venture capitalist, and it put out this survey to several students. One was on Heidi Roizen and one was on Howard Roizen. They're the same person. Heidi is the real graduate, and Howard is her male counterpart. And since they're the same person, they have all the same qualifications. They have the same GPA, they have the same work history, but they wanted to see what the students had to say about them just by changing their first name, where one was clearly identified as a woman and one was identified as a male. Thankfully, it came out pretty clear that all the students agreed that Heidi and Howard had the same basic qualifications and were both very good, obviously, at what they do. The difference was that when they looked at their personalities, Heidi was bossy and self-serving, while Howard was somebody you could go fishing with and approachable. So, I mean, it's pretty concrete stuff. It's a pretty well-known study. This is a problem. As I began to kind of play around with Google Ngrams more, I found out that you could put a little asterisk after bossy and see what comes up the most after that. So it gave me the top 10 results of the words or the phrases that the first word that usually follows bossy. We have and or with as shield in sculptures, woman, shields, and beaten. So, I mean, these bossy and bossy or bossy as are all kind of referring to the adjective that I'm looking for. Bossy woman. That's the only person that shows up. So that's really that kind of means something. So, but I also wanted to look at what people were grasping at when they were saying bossy and bossy or. So bossy and controlling, demanding, domineering, overbearing, aggressive, dominating, always. They're not good things. Bossy is associated with a lot of bad qualities, not necessarily just being the boss and being in charge, but it has a very clear negative connotation. And as we saw in the last slide, people typically associate it with women over man or being vague and just saying person. Bossy or Um, it's kind of people just grasping for like synonyms like bossy and controlling, bossy and dictatorial, bossy and demanding, domineering, aggressive, pushy, dominating. But the one that kind of stuck out to me was or anything. And I kind of thought that this would go in the direction of like saying like, oh, I just don't want to be bossy or anything. Like somebody like expressing that like their fear of wanting to stay away from that, and I figured it would typically be girls. And I was right. Um, the most references for Boss or anything were actually between 1984 and 1985, even when you look at the beginning of Enneagrams all the way up to the year 2000. Um, this had a lot of references that that one the 2 years were categorized by themselves. Um, and all references were about women who did not want to be considered bossy or anything, like expressing their fears to like a friend. Like that's what all the quotes were. Like I clicked for several pages, and that's what it was. Then I also looked at 1996 and 1997, and I didn't find the exact phrase like bossy or anything. This came up because it said anything and bossy in the same paragraph, but I thought it was an interesting quote that kind of explains this issue here. It's from a book called Gift and Children Myths and Realities. And this quote says, "What is seen as leadership in a boy is often seen as bossiness in a girl. Perhaps this is because the traits of independence and achievement displayed by the gifted violate the stereotype of a girl much more than the boy." Also in Google Ngrams, you can show or you can look up how often the word bossy modifies the word women. So there's a couple peaks that are pretty clear to me around the 1950s and then in the 1990s. And if you think about it, female participation in the workforce increased 60% during World War One, and then in 1945, during World War Two, and then in 1945, World War Two ends, and men come back to work. And so these qualities in women, like basically, like they were seen as undesirable. Women were supposed to go back home and leave their jobs, and that was a problem. And then you think about like the social changes and like what was presented in the media in the 90s. And I mean, you have Missy Elliott, Destiny's Child, like very popular characters like Kat from 10 Things I Hate About You, Gwen Stefani, and like the First Wives Club. Like all of these things were very popular in the 90s, and it kind of just symbolized the social movement that was taking place. Like, um, yeah, and then it peaks in 2000. And I found an article by Naomi Wolf that was talking about feminism being dead. She wrote this in 1999. She said that like the feminism of the 90s was dying out and that like we couldn't let that happen because feminism takes like a 20 to 30 year cycle, and it always gets pushed down by some other social movement or like war, or it just always ends up dying out every 20 to 30 years like once it gets its start again. And I don't know, you can actually kind of see that trend here. And I mean, it was either people being okay with the role that women were taking, or it was that women started to step back, which I would like to take another look at maybe for my final project, do um, more research into this, kind of combine the steps that I've taken and go a little farther if I can. So look out for part 3 maybe. Thank you so much for listening.